The year was 67 AD, and in the heart of the Roman Empire, where the marble gleamed with stolen wealth, and the wine ran thicker than mercy, a shadow deeper than politics had taken hold of the palace. Emperor Nero, once a golden child of the Julio-Claudian line, had long since slipped into the folds of madness, his court bloated with flattery, fear, and indulgence. Behind the drapes of velvet and the laughter of staged banquets, there was a hunger in him, not for conquest, nor justice, but for something he had destroyed with his own hands. Her name had been Poppaea Sabina. She was his wife, his obsession, and by all accounts, the only person who ever made the monster seem human. Beautiful, ambitious, and cunning, Poppaea knew how to tame Nero's fire, but even she could not survive his rage. When she became pregnant, their arguments intensified, and in a fit of fury, he kicked her in the abdomen, ending both her life and the unborn heir. She died screaming in the palace halls, surrounded by gold and fear, and in that moment, something shattered in Nero that could never be put back together. The empire did not mourn, it feared. But Nero? He mourned not in repentance but in obsession. He could not let her go, and so, in a gesture that blurred the line between madness and ritual, he decided to bring her back. Not with magic nor with statues, but with flesh. Sporus was a young boy, delicate in features, fair of skin, barely old enough to understand what he was about to become. He had been a palace page, barely noticed among the flurry of slaves and attendants, but one day Nero's eye fell on him, and something clicked. The boy resembled Poppaea, enough to make the emperor pause, enough to make the pain twist into something twisted. Without consent, without mercy, the boy was taken. They castrated him, surgically removing what nature had given him so that he might better play the part. And when the wounds healed, Nero dressed him in silk, adorned him in Poppaea's jewelry, and paraded him as a bride. A full Roman wedding was staged. Nero wore the veil of the groom. Sporus wore the veil of the dead. Rome, sickened and afraid, whispered behind their hands, but never out loud. The senators, too craven to oppose him, attended the ceremony in silence, their faces still but their hearts heavy. For Sporus had not become a man, nor had he remained a boy. He had been turned into an echo, a living replica of a dead empress, kept alive by a man who mistook obsession for love. But Sporus, though silenced, was not a blank canvas. In his eyes burned confusion, horror, and above all the fear of survival. Every day he walked the halls dressed as her. Every night, he slept beside the man who had murdered the woman he was forced to become. Nero called him Sabina in public, kissed him on balconies, showed him off to the crowds as if daring them to challenge his delusion. And no one did, because Nero was emperor, because Rome had grown so numb to cruelty that it could no longer tell the difference between madness and law. In the lavishly perfumed corridors of the Domus, Aurea, Nero's golden palace, Sporus drifted like a ghost, alive but never living, groomed to be memory, never identity, and behind it all, Nero believed he had conquered death, that by remaking Poppaea in the flesh of a boy, he had undone the mistake that haunted him. But the gods, even in a world as cruel as Rome, did not smile upon such arrogance, and deep within the marble walls, Rome's future was already cracking, for no empire can survive when its throne is held by a man chasing ghosts in the shape of children. When Nero died in 68 AD, alone, hunted, abandoned by the very Senate that once feared him, Rome exhaled for the first time in over a decade. His final words, "What an artist dies in me," were not a lament for Rome, but for himself. The palace walls that had once echoed with music, madness, and cruelty fell silent, but not all shadows died with the tyrant. Sporus, the boy who had been reshaped into a woman's image, did not vanish when the emperor did. No, he remained, not as a figure of power, but as a relic, a living wound from a reign built on fear. In the chaotic years that followed Nero's death, 3 emperors rose and fell in rapid succession: Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, each scrambling to seize control of the broken empire. And somehow, through it all, Sporus survived, drifting from palace to palace, no longer called Sabina, but still seen only through the lens of who he had been forced to become. Otho, who had once been married to Poppaea before Nero took her, took Sporus into his household, not out of love, but perhaps guilt or calculation, or some sick sense of irony. Rumors say he treated Sporus kindly, but kindness was an unfamiliar currency in Rome. When Otho committed suicide after losing a civil war, Sporus found himself passed again like a possession, this time to Vitellius, who planned to humiliate him in public by dressing him as a sacrificial bride and executing him during a festival. But Sporus had learned one lesson above all. Rome might not care for the innocent, but it rarely forgot spectacle. He would not give them one more. Before the day arrived, before the trumpets could sound, Sporus took his own life, quietly, desperately, on his own terms. The boy who had been renamed, reshaped, and paraded as a ghost bride of an emperor chose finally to become no one. His story, left out of marble carvings and official scrolls, lived on only in whispers. The tragedy of a child silenced by power, a mirror that reflected not just Nero's madness but Rome's decay. And so Sporus vanished not in fire or fame but in stillness, a casualty of empire, obsession, and the kind of love that destroys everything it touches. He had forgotten what his voice once sounded like. In the flickering light of the oil lamp, Sporus sat wrapped in silk that had long since stopped feeling soft. It was too quiet now, no music, no banquets, no footsteps behind him calling him Sabina. Just silence and the heaviness of memory. He looked down at his hands, once small and tender, now calloused from clenching everything he could never say. Rome had passed him around like a jewel, polished and displayed, admired and never understood. First as a bride, then as a ghost, then as a joke. They called him Poppaea, Sabina, Nero's wife, the empress that wasn't, but never Sporus, never himself. What was his name before all this? What did he dream of when he was still a boy and not a symbol? He didn't remember. Maybe there had never been time to dream. The small silver blade trembled in his fingers. Not from fear, but from final clarity. He had been made into someone else for so long that the only way to become himself again was to disappear. Rome would not remember him as a statesman, nor as a rebel. He had no wars to his name, no laws in his honor, but he would not let them have one more laugh. He would not be dragged into an arena in a wedding dress, paraded for the amusement of a crowd that never cared. This would be his rebellion, not with fire but with silence, not with a scream but with stillness. And so, in that dim chamber as the empire tore itself apart outside, Sporus breathed deeply for the first time, not as Nero's bride, not as Poppaea's reflection, but as a boy who had no name and claimed it with death. When they found him, he was still, serene, draped in white, and somewhere in the hush that followed, Rome forgot how to laugh. For in the end, his quiet defiance echoed louder than Nero's roar ever did. They did not bury him with honors. There was no procession, no marble sarcophagus etched with his name. There were no poems written, no temples built, no coins minted in his image. When they found Sporus's body in that quiet chamber, they didn't say a prayer, they simply removed it. Quietly, quickly, as though death were a mess to clean up, not a tragedy to mourn. No one knew where his body was laid to rest, or if it was laid at all. Rome had no use for remembrance when the memory itself was an indictment. The court never spoke of him again. Vitellius, too busy trying to save his collapsing rule, never uttered the name. And so Sporus, the boy who had been forced to wear a crown he never wanted, disappeared from history the same way he had entered it, without choice, without voice, without even a name of his own. But silence has a way of lingering, and in the years that followed, Sporus became a whisper. His story passed not through monuments, but through shadows, through side glances in court, through scandalous scrolls that senators read in secret, through the quiet horror of every servant who remembered the wedding with no bride, the empress with no soul, in every child forced to play a role not their own, in every name rewritten by power, in every life broken for spectacle. There was a piece of Sporus. He became a symbol not of femininity or masculinity, but of what power does when it forgets humanity. Long after the Julio-Claudian line collapsed, after Rome burned again and rebuilt itself in marble and blood, his story remained, not in statues but in warnings. Historians argued whether he was a man, a woman, or neither. But they missed the point. Sporus was not a question of gender or history. He was a reminder that the most terrifying empire on earth could not erase the shame it inflicted, that a child can become a mirror, and sometimes the mirror outlives the emperor. And though no tomb bears his name, and no hymn sings of his sorrow. Those who dare to look into the silence will still find him there, waiting, watching, enduring in the place where all forgotten names live, just beyond the reach of empire, but never beyond the reach of truth. They say Rome never truly dies, it only changes its face. Empires fall, crowns crumble, statues erode, but the stories that shame them never fade. And in that long shadow of the world's most powerful empire, the name Sporus still breathes, not in marble but in myth. Some say his spirit never left the golden halls where his identity was stolen, that when the wind howls through the ruins of Nero's palace, you can hear soft footsteps, the echo of a boy forced to walk in shoes never meant for him. Others say his name became a whisper among slaves and servants, passed down through generations not as history, but as a warning. That love without consent is not love at all, that power, when left unchecked, turns even memory into a weapon. A few believe he was reborn, in another place, another time, in a body that was finally his own, free of masks, free of names not chosen, walking not as a ghost but as a voice. But perhaps the most haunting truth of all is that he was never supposed to be remembered. His story was meant to vanish, erased by emperors, buried under wars and politics, smothered by shame. And yet here we are, saying his name, Sporus, not the bride, not the shadow of Poppaea, not Nero's doll, just a boy who lived, a boy who resisted in the only way he could, by surviving. Until survival was no longer enough. His death was quiet, but his legacy is not. His story now belongs to those who were never allowed to write their own. In that, he has outlived the empire that tried to own him. He left no heir, no statue, no family line, but he left something far more enduring, a wound in history where truth refused to bleed out. Sporus lives not in Rome's glory, but in its silence.